everyone, and welcome to the ninth Rise Talk on the topic of Faultlines, conflicts, and resilience in computer-mediated communications. My name is Jacqueline Yu, an ESRC postdoctoral fellow at Durham University Business School. Today's talk will be given by our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Sherry Thatcher, who is the J.Henry Fellors Professor of Business Administration at the Dysfunctional School of Business at the University of South Carolina. She is one of the world-leading experts in the area of team Faultlines. I will provide a more detailed introduction about our distinguished guest speaker shortly after a brief introduction of the Rise Talk initiative. The Rise Talk is a series of research seminars funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and hosted by the Center for Innovation and Technology Management in partnership with the Global Citizenship Program, Houston College, Durham University. The aim of the Rise Talk is to facilitate an interdisciplinary discussing and exploration of how traditional theories inform us to understand the contemporary phenomenon, resilience, innovation, strategy, and ecosystem, and how the role of RISE can help to address some of the challenges and issues faced by business and society in achieving sustainable development goals. Today, we are very delighted to have our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Sherry Thatcher from the Dysfunctional School of Business at the University of South Carolina. She currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the Academy of Management Review. Her PhD is in organizational behavior from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests focus on diversity, identity, and conflict. Her work appears in the top journals in the field of business and management, including the Academy of Management Review, Academy of Management Journal, Academy of Management Annals, Journal of Applied Psychology, Organization Science, Journal of Management, Journal of Management Studies, and Decision Support Systems. Drawing from her research on Faultlines and intra-group conflict in today's talk, she will discuss how resilience building or resilience undermining manifests in team conflict caused by fault lines. Thank you very much for joining us, Sherry. Without further ado, please join me to welcome Professor Sherry Thatcher.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for that great introduction, and I'm really excited to be here. I don't study resilience. I don't know a lot about the research in that particular area, and I know that many of the talks that have come before me have been on very macro, very large topics. But this was a really great opportunity to reflect on my research and how it might be linked to resilience. So in many ways, this is more of just kind of a thought experiment in terms of some of the issues I'm going to raise, and I would love to just have an open conversation. So feel free at any time to jump in and let's have a conversation. So as Jacqueline mentioned, RISE is Resilience, Innovation, Strategy, and Ecosystems. And my research mainly is in the area of teams. And in many ways, teams are an ecosystem at a much smaller, more micro level, but they are systems of individuals that are working together to perform something. And fault lines can be a disruption. We'll talk more about that. Conflict certainly is a disruption to those ecosystems. And as we think about COVID and all of the ways that it's forced us to engage in communications via computer mediation, that can also be seen as potential disruptions. So those are kind of the set of topics that I'm going to discuss today. So this is the basic agenda, which I've just kind of gone over. I'll give you a little bit of my personal background and how I got interested in this area of research, and then talk a little bit about what we know about fault lines, conflict, and then talk more speculatively about how that relates to computer mediation and resilience. So I'm originally from Hawaii, and I don't put that up there so everybody is really jealous. And actually there's a reason for it. Growing up on a very small island as a Caucasian in a country that is very Asian, or in a state that's very Asian and Polynesian, there actually was quite a bit of prejudice and racism against white people. And so even though I'm an American from a more white-dominant society, I had the experience of experiencing racism and prejudice. And it gave me a really interesting perspective on why do people react to others just because of the color of the skin or where they grew up. So I've always been interested in diversity issues because of that personal background and trying to understand what is really going on. I've also had a number of international experiences when I was really young. So in my 20s, I spent a lot of time in Asia. I had some independent research project there, and I went by myself to a number of different countries and conducted that research. I also then went back and lived in Thailand for a couple of years, and then lived in Micronesia and helped small businesses. So that also shaped my views of diversity and people working together and how we can learn from each other's differences. Yes?
The people online ask us to share the screen.
Oh, okay.
Okay, maybe. Okay, yeah, we can zoom.
Speaking of computer-mediated difficulties.
Where is the okay. That's the one. Okay, share the screen.
And then the full
There you go. Yeah, perfect.
oops. And then maybe, can you maybe minimize that window? Yes, super. Great.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, so as I was working in Micronesia, I was traveling a lot. It was kind of like a nonprofit consultant type of job. And I thought, man, my parents are school teachers, and I used to say I'm never going to be a teacher, but those summers off would be really nice. So I thought, well, I guess I'll go get my PhD, do that dissertation thing, even though I'm not really interested in research, just so I can be a teacher and have my summers off. But lo and behold, after I went to Wharton, I fell in love with the research because I was able to really think deeply about diversity and all those questions that I had had. And so I ended up taking a research position and having positions at a variety of places as listed up here. So in terms of my background, so like I said, my experiences really got me focused on being interested in diversity and relational demography. My advisor was Karen Jen, if you know her work, and if you know anything about conflict, you know her work. And she said, yes, you have to study with conflict. I'm like, well, I'm not really interested in conflict. She said, yes, you are. So, yes, I am. So I studied diversity as it relates to conflict, and of course, that's performance. But in doing that, I felt like there was, at the time that I was studying these issues, there was a focus on similarities and differences, very superficial. And my experiences didn't match that. And so I felt we needed to dig deeper into the identity literature in order to make those connections. And so that's what I became interested in for my dissertation. I then ended up, because of the dual career situation, in a management information systems department. And at that time, I was then trying to transition to studying teams in virtual environments, looking at telecommuting and the distribution and what that does for teams when they have to work together. And then finally, as I was finishing up my dissertation, a great paper by Lau and Murnian came out, an Academy of Management review about fault lines. And I just thought that that was the best thing ever. It was really exciting to me to think about diversity from this different perspective. And that really led me on this path where over the past 20 years I've been really interested in fault lines and the various ways that it impacts teams. So, what are fault lines? a geological perspective, this is what they look like, right? And what's interesting about fault lines from a geological perspective? Feel free to answer.
Breaks unbreakable.
Okay, it's unbreakable, yeah. What else? There's some cracks there.
You don't know how to repair.
It's hard to repair it, right? Why is it hard to repair?
You need to find the right mechanism to repair that.
Okay, you need to find the right mechanism. It's hard because they're so deep.
Yeah.
And why are they deep? Because it's crack upon crack upon crack that are aligned, right? If you had a crack this way and a crack this way, they would just be both superficial or not very deep cracks that you could probably repair, throw in some cement, do something like that. But when you have these really deep cracks, then it's really hard to cross that division. So if we think about fault lines then in teams, and we take that analogy, Lau and Murnian, the definition that they came up with was dividing lines and groups between relatively homogeneous subgroups on the basis of the simultaneous alignment of multiple demographic characteristics. So let's take this example of two teams. Okay? In this first team, labeled weak fault line group, we have 4 people. We have 2 females, 2 males, 2 22-year-olds, a 48-year-old, a 50-year-old, 2 accountants, 2 engineers. In the strong fault line group, we have exactly those same people. We have 2 22-year-olds, a 48-year-old, a 50-year-old, 2 males, 2 females, 2 accountants, 2 engineers. So from a diversity perspective, they are the same. If you measure their diversity, they'd have the same score. But if you look at it from a fault line perspective, they look very different, right? In the weak fault line group, the 2 females are different ages and different backgrounds in terms of functional area. The 2 accountants are different genders and different ages. So there's lots of ways that they may interact with one another based on their similarities in these different ways. The strong fault line group, on the other hand, you have the 2 22-year-old female engineers on one side and the 48-year-old, 50-year-old male accountants on the other side. How do you think this plays out when people are interacting? Okay.
There will be few potential problems, like the age will be one thing, that's a big gap. On the other hand, if you look at their professions are also very different, right? Engineers talk to accountants might be very, very different. So this might be the potential problem. And of course, we know the gender thing, that's the pattern how people really frame the communication, also like the content-wise, profession might interfere in between. There will be lots of difficulty in my
in your opinion.
Yeah, in my opinion.
So what we see, yes, is that within these subgroups, there's a lot of similarity. Tends to be a lot of similarity. That we've grown up in the same era. We're the same gender. We've experienced the same training. So we tend to think alike and react to situations in a similar way. But then when you have to interact with people across the subgroup, we tend to see much more conflict than in the weak fault line group, where there's lots of these ways that people feel some connection. Okay, so the rationale for why this matters, the structure matters, is because it creates both this internal to the subgroup, like this sense of belonging and great interaction, but then across the subgroups, much more strife and conflict. In 2012, Pankaj Patel and I did a review of the fault lines literature. At that time, there were not a ton of studies. There's probably around 50 or 60. But what we did find just from this quantitative review was basically that demographic fault line strength, so the extent to which there really was this fault line, led to all forms of conflict and also negatively affected performance and satisfaction. More recently, I'm working on a meta-analysis which is under review right now, so you're seeing kind of on the front lines to see the results. Hopefully it gets published soon. And we have a lot more studies now that look at fault lines. And what we do know, and I'm just going to point out the relationships to conflict because that's what we're going to focus on today. Dormant fault lines, which had been studied, those were the things I talked about in my example, often lead to activated fault lines. So if you see the fault line, there may be a fault line, I don't really notice it, but if we see it, then it really causes conflict. That's where the conflict comes from, right? It's that perception of the fact that these subgroups exist. And then when we have conflict, we have lower levels of team performance. Okay, so we in fact find this finding continues to hold true across many, many more studies over the last 10 years. So what is conflict now? Okay, so we kind of talked about fault lines, what fault lines are, and that they lead to conflict, but let's do a deep dive into conflict. Okay, all sorts of ways that we see conflict, right? Sometimes you say, well, it's a workplace. There's no conflict, we're all adults here, right? Here's just a little cartoon, you played well, son, but you have to learn not to throw a tantrum whenever things don't go your way. There's plenty of time for that after you enter the workforce, right? Unfortunately, there's some greater truth in that. So conflict is when one party perceives that its interests are being opposed by another party at a very broad-based level. Okay, so you aren't getting what you want, and so there's something blocking you from achieving that. So Amason in 1996 published a paper and really distinguished between functional conflict and dysfunctional conflict. And this is pretty, I mean, we can understand that at a very basic level, right? Some conflicts can be very good for us because they force us to think differently. They get us to maybe get out of our mindset and can be more creative. But some conflicts, obviously, are quite dysfunctional. And that's often what we think about when we think of the word conflict, that it's negative and has this negative ramification. But Jen, in her work, said not only can we think about functional, dysfunctional, but we should distinguish between types. Okay? So process conflict is when a conflict is about how something gets done. Should we hold a workshop, or should we just do an online meeting? What is the best way to train PhD students? Right? There may be a variety of different ways. And if we disagree about how to do it, then that's process conflict. There is also task conflict. What are we actually trying to do? And you'd be surprised at how much task conflict exists. You know, Olga might say, okay, we're going to increase the research engagement. And you think that means one thing, and you think that means something else. And so if you don't agree on what it means, what you're trying to do, then you're going to be at odds, right? You're going to be working in different directions, not really having some outcome that's positive. And then finally, there's relationship conflict, which is relationship over personal issues or the person itself, him or herself. So let's just walk through some examples, because it's always fun to think about what this really means rather than just the abstract concepts. Your boss calls a meeting to say that you are losing orders and your team needs to fix it. Okay. The young accountants think that customers are being unreasonable and that all that is required is a conversation with the customers to tell them that they are unreasonable. The older marketers believe that the customer should be given a discount on future orders to keep their business and win back their loyalty. What type of conflict would you say this is? Task, okay, yeah. So what are we really trying to do, right? And is there a fault line in terms of that, for those perspectives? Yeah, right, because we have the young accountants thinking that the task is one thing, and then we have these the older marketers that think it's something else. Okay, and so this could start off as a task conflict that may be driven by the fault lines and how people perceive the world and what the job is. And it could, the leader could come in and solve this problem. The leader could also not solve it, and it festers and becomes something much bigger. Okay. You walk into a meeting and Bob and Karen are having a big argument. Bob is childless and is telling Karen that the benefits she receives because she has 2 young children, like working from home, or flexible hours is unfair to him because he must take on a larger workload. What type of conflict is this? More relationship, right? Because it's about what someone has or doesn't have, and it's affecting someone else's goals. Is there a fault line? Okay, you can say maybe female, male, childless, or with children, but it's only two people.
It's only with workload in a way.
It's only what?
With workload, kind of, because apparently Bob think he's taking more workload.
Right.
Karen is not. And the child thing is basically her excuse that she got more benefits, like working from home, just flexible hours and so on, right?
Yeah, so there's definitely relationship conflict there. The fault line is, right now it's not necessarily a fault line, it's a relationship conflict because there's two people. But if others in the surrounding area say, oh yeah, there are others that are like that, and it starts to become a foundation upon which the fault line grows, then it becomes more problematic. The other thing to notice is oftentimes different types of conflicts are often interwoven in these examples, right? So it might have started off as a process conflict, like how does work get done, and evolved into something more relationship focused, where you're really focusing on the fact that you have children or something like that. The project is behind schedule and the boss needs everyone who can come in over the weekend for 4 hours. The only workers who show up are those who are single and they are unhappy. What type of conflict is the cause of this unhappiness?
I feel like
Process? Yeah, so the work needs to get done, but how are we going to get it done? The boss thinks it should be done one way, so he suggests that way, but others don't agree with it, they're really unhappy, so the process conflict is what's driving this. And then yes, is there a fault line between those who are married or not, right? So we can see that. So we can see that fault lines and conflict, and even these small examples are very salient to people. Another way to think about conflict, and this is when we really kind of tease apart task and process and relationship conflict and what effect they have on team performance, is to think about what happens in low-performing teams with respect to conflict and what happens in high-performing teams. What would be your guess in high-performing teams? Is there conflict in high-performing teams?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Always.
Always? There's always conflict no matter what? Okay.
Always there's something people might disagree with each other.
Okay. Any other ideas?
How do you define performance? The efficiency of doing the work or the number of
The
ideas?
task gets done.
Yeah.
The task, whatever it is,
But
gets
they are
done.
more progressive, like it can be good conflicts, the result to improvements
Okay.
in the long run for the high performing teams.
Okay, so maybe we have more good conflict in the high-performing teams. Oh, I don't know if you can see these colors very well. Anyway, I'll try to walk through it. So this bottom here is kind of the time of a project. So initial, when you start, to the ending of the project. This is how much conflict there is on the y-axis. So in terms of low-performing teams, what you would see, and these numbers aren't exact, I was just trying to put them in there so you get this general slope of the curve, is that there's a lot of relationship conflict. That's that line up here that goes up and stays high. So the conflict at the relationship level never really gets resolved. You spend a lot of energy and time on that conflict. The process conflict is down here. You don't have any at the beginning because you just jump right in. You jump right in and it increases as you go up because you're very frustrated with others about how they're doing things and how we're going to get to the end. And then task conflict, you start up, you don't really talk about it, you talk about it a little bit and say, yeah, okay, let's just do this. And then it starts to increase as you move through the life of the project because you really haven't had good discussions around it. Okay, so you see how the conflict is increasing as the life of the project goes on in terms of all types of conflict. High-performing teams, it looks a little different. And you're right, it's not that there's no conflict. because it's really good to have certain conflicts at certain times. So for the task conflict, it's great to have a lot of it right at the beginning. Like you're all in there and you're saying, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. And then you come to some agreement. And so it goes down really quickly, and because you're focused on the task. Okay? Process conflict the same way. Once you start, you're kind of working on different things, then you get into a groove, and so you're less likely to have that process conflict. But what happens at the end of a project? Oh no, I thought you were going to do that. I thought you were going to do that, right? So we have a little bit of a bump at the end in terms of process conflict. And relationship conflict is pretty low the whole way through. If it arises, because yes, sometimes it arises, you squash it, right? And then it does not become the focus of the team interactions. So again, just kind of a brief look at low-performing teams. This is the trajectory. High-performing teams, this is what you see. So with all of that as background, in terms of fault lines, in terms of conflict, in terms of what we know about the different types of conflict, let's think about the computer-mediated context. And COVID is such a natural experiment for us all, right? Because everybody was moving to having more interactions via computer mediation, but then COVID just kind of threw us all into a lot of situations where we didn't have choices, and we had to deal with it. So we have fewer in-person interactions, more email communication, more virtual meetings communications, more IM chat communications. What do fault lines and conflict look like in these type of interactions? So think about that question. I'm going to hopefully show a video if it works, and then we'll get back to this question. Maybe not. Let's see. Oh.
Yeah.
Trip Crosby
has joined the meeting.
Beth?
Has joined the meeting.
Hello?
Tyler?
No, this is Beth from ICS.
Oh, hey Beth. How are you doing?
Oh, good. Yeah. Just making it,
Tyler?
Has joined the meeting.
All right, well, this is Trip. Who's here? Tyler's here.
Beth's here.
Okay, the purpose of today's meeting is to discuss the...
Yeah, I'll be able to do it in like 30 minutes. John?
Has joined the meeting.
Hi, John.
Hi.
I was just trying to go over the purpose of today's meeting, which is to discuss the Tyler?
Has joined the meeting.
Sorry guys, I got cut off. Is Paul here? Send him an invite.
Put in your access code.
No, that's your PIN number.
It should be a 9-digit number.
Try pressing the pound key.
Paul.
Has joined the meeting.
Any questions before we move on?
Yes, this is Beth. What's our best plan of attack for the second quarter?
Question
What
actually...
we should do.
Oh,
Go ahead. Oh, I think
Well,
what we should do.
It actually
really
depends on
diversify.
how you look at it, because the
really
really Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think
Given sales, we're at
Let me just say that
Okay.
it was a great graph, John. Tyler?
Well, my main concern with the projections from Gier was that they're just insufficient. I mean, they're not even taking into account.
Did we lose Tyler again?
Hello?
John, are you guys taking distributions? John?
Oh, my bad. I was on mute. Let me start over.
So I've prepared a presentation. I'm sharing it with all of you. You should be able to see it on your screen right now.
Got it.
I don't see a link anywhere.
It says I need to download a plugin.
We are all using Macs, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
How can you?
Financials are looking great. Paul, do you have any comments on staffing?
I was thinking about that because we get a few more contractor types in. Hold on, I'm sorry. Rex, get down!
No, I feel like when I went to the first last year, I couldn't really go into it. So if you would really tighten that up, then I
To me, staffing is a huge thing. Is that me? Is that me?
It's not me, I don't think.
I just want to go over a couple of details as we move into our next section here. We got 3 new departments coming on board.
Break it up a little bit, guys.
By the end of Q3.
I'm
So
dead
I need
spot.
everyone to give me detailed evaluations each
Sorry,
month
guys.
so that we know. That's it, guys. Beth, you'll send out a recap email that could have basically taken the place of this whole meeting, correct?
Yep, always do.
Yeah, thanks for doing that, Beth. Dave, you been here the whole time? Yeah. Huh. Well,
So, anyway, let me see if I can.
Trip
start this.
Crosby.
Has joined the meeting.
No, you don't want to see that again.
Painful memories.
It's painful memories, right? And even though some of that isn't true in Zoom meetings, it's still, a lot of that is true in Zoom meetings, right? And so if you think about some of these interactions that you've had, whether they be more of these conference calls, virtual meetings, or even just email, or the ways that you interact via computer mediation, where would you see, or do you see, fault lines or conflict? Yes?
Just one more, just to put a little bit more salt and pepper on.
Yes.
There is also chat.
Yes, and chats, of course.
Enabled,
Yes.
technology-enabled channel to create fault lines, even if we don't have them. That private chat, right? That I'm connecting and start back talking.
Exactly. Okay, so that's exactly one way, right? With a chat function, I can say, okay, I'm going to say a snide comment, and let you two hear it, and everybody else is unaware. So I'm creating this fault line of this subgroup of people. Okay? Yeah, absolutely. What else? All of your meetings are perfect?
No. It's, we followed, companies throughout 2020, kind of in every day in Denmark, big project, and particularly on virtual meetings in the spring, there was lots of fine things.
Oh, I would
there
love
was
to see that.
Lots of qualitative data. So, and the interesting thing, there was lots of expected fault lines, and I know that's what we should talk about, but I just wanted to also point out that there was one interesting and unexpected finding that our respondents said that virtual meetings are actually much more democratic because it has new buttons and it gave a race for introverts, and extroverts were really obviously behaving like this, but skillful team leaders,
yes,
they received so much of insights from those who were not supposed to be, loud in the normal meeting rooms. So,
yes.
So there was a clear, definitely a fault line, but sometimes it even.
Sometimes the communication or the technology allows, right, for the better management of potential fault lines.
Yeah, but it's really seldom.
Yes, yes. It is a hard thing. Like, a manager really needs to spend a lot of time thinking about how they're going to do that, because the technology also allows a lot of behaviors, right, that maybe you wouldn't do in person. So, and just thinking, as soon as we started doing all these Zoom calls, I started wondering what was going on in people's minds. Like, is their camera on? Why is their camera not on? Is there some reason in terms of they're not interested in the content of the meeting? Is it because, or is there something about all of the people with their cameras off versus those that don't? Like, what is going on behind the scenes that we don't really know? Whereas if you're in a face-to-face meeting, you can kind of gauge the room, right? So some potential fault lines, and these are just things that I've been kind of mulling over in virtual meetings, are first, who shows up for meetings and who doesn't? Is there any kind of consistent trend that you can see? Right? And is this a reflection of a fault line of some sort in your team? People who are engaged versus those who don't. And this is where, like you said, a team leader may be able to pull out more of those introverts. I'd really like to hear your opinion and mute everyone else, right? Those who show their faces versus those who don't. Those who are distracted and those who aren't. And like women playing solitaire on her computer. Doing email or other things when they should be doing what, listening to your meeting. Personal concerns, children, animals, and you see the distraction that happens, and people included in the side chats versus those who aren't. And then the same in email and IMs, I think differences in who receives communication versus subgroups, and then uses of CCs and BCCs, right, can result in being included, excluded when you want to, don't want to, and in very sometimes passive-aggressive ways. Yes?
I was wondering, they also, and again, this is just the observations from the study, who show up and when. So some of our respondents, although, some team leaders said, I'll be there 10 minutes before. So some of the respondents noticed that some of the key and most powerful players would like to show up earlier to have other side conversations or being more present.
Right.
I don't know if it's relevant.
No, absolutely. Like I said, these are just my thoughts. So I first of all would love to see that study, but I welcome any other thoughts on this as well, because I think it's a really interesting thing that we're going to have to understand a little bit better. And not just coming early, but when people say, oh, would you two stay after so I can talk to you? Right? And what does that signal to everyone else? Like, are they more important? Did they do something wrong? Like, you don't know, right? Other things, so the virtual meeting conflicts, we have reluctance to speak up, conflict avoidance, only some people speak, or misinterpretation, sometimes because of those technological glitches, sometimes just because people aren't really expressing themselves in a way that they can be understood. In terms of email or instant messaging conflicts, I think sometimes people say things they wouldn't normally say, right? We know that from research a long time ago that in the written word, people will, because they're not, I'm not saying it to you in person, so I might be a little more aggressive in how I communicate with you. People interpret things incorrectly. I'm sure you all have those experiences. No, that's not what I meant to say. People give meaning to a lack of reply. This used to drive me crazy. I was kind of around at the time when email first started, right? So, and then you wonder, are you not responding to me because you're mad at me? Because you think what I said was stupid? Because you're busy? Or what? I don't know. Because you're not responding. And so I read a lot into the lack of something. And then people give meanings to changes in style, and I'll give you an example of that as well. So here's saying what I might normally not say face-to-face. An example is, I'm so frustrated. You said you're going to get this done by the 15th, and it's the 17th, and I still haven't heard from you. Can you tell me when you're really going to get it to me? So what about that language or that email maybe gets you a little bit annoyed?
Like blaming.
Okay, it has a blaming the language itself, the words itself.
Yeah. Also, it's not professional in a way.
Okay.
Right. It's involve personal emotions there.
A lot of emotions, and but team members interact like this, right? A lot, like they're very informal. They throw in all caps, they throw in exclamation points, they throw in lots of question marks. Like all of these are signals of frustration. So maybe this person then got that email and said, CC the boss, right? Okay, now we're going to include someone else because I didn't like that tone. It was done by the 15th. You didn't tell me you needed it by the 15th. If you had told me, then I would have given it to you in addition to Jane. And I don't appreciate your tone and how you're talking to me. So now all of a sudden, what was just, if I had seen you in person, I just would have said, hey, do you have it done? I thought it was done by 17th. And it would have been over. But when you go through these channels, it escalates it sometimes in ways that are really take up more time and are very frustrating. This is one that actually happened to me. So I wrote to a colleague, not Sarah, someone else, and said, I hope you're doing well. I've attached a draft of a manuscript. Please let me know what you think. Take care, Sherry. Her response, Dear Sherry, thank you for the manuscript. I've made some changes. Looking forward to hearing from you, Sarah. And I responded, there are a number of problems in the manuscript. Let's set up a time to talk, Sherry. She was so angry with me and did not talk to me for 2 months.
Oh, wow.
And finally, I said, what is going on? Like, I haven't heard from you and you haven't responded. And she said, well, I don't know why you were so angry with me. And I said, why? And it turns out that email, I was busy, so I was just trying to respond to her to let her know. She was reading into it that I was really upset with what she'd done with the manuscript because I wasn't answering her in the same manner that I normally respond to emails, right? So again, that perception of what people read into what you write can be misinterpreted, and it takes up so much time to resolve. And so now what happens? We end up taking a lot of time in crafting all of our emails, right? Because you know that happens. So we do spend a lot more time just trying to communicate effectively when we have to use this computer-mediated communication. So one thing we do know, Zoom fatigue is real, right? And we don't enjoy doing it. It gets very exhausting and frustrating. So I just want to, again, this is me spitballing like what I know of the resilience literature and some of the talks I've heard and kind of how people think about resilience is what are some of the things we need to think about both for undermining resilience or building resilience to deal with these issues. So things that can undermine resilience are like lack of empathy, right? So you just get so frustrated you don't put yourself in the other person's shoes, and so you kind of either get more frustrated or give up on the interaction. The Zoom fatigue, mental health concerns, oh my gosh, there's so much literature now, right? So many people studying this, mental health concerns that come not just from the computer-mediated interactions, but all of their views of what is really happening, and I think it's really depleting. The uncertainty surrounding, all the examples that I gave you. Leader indifference. You talked about, how good leaders can really create this great opportunity with computer mediation, but more often than not, leaders are either busy or indifferent to what's going on. And so they don't see the fault line, they don't see the conflicts, or if they do, they feel like they're just too small to worry about, but they fester and they grow. And then lack of team member support. So you're all in this together having to deal with these communications, but if some people care a little bit more, put a little bit more time and effort, and others don't, then you're likely to have a very frustrated and ineffective team. So in terms of building resilience, I think I've heard that there's basically 3 phases, right? So one is readiness and preparation. So this is what can you do before the problems actually arise to set yourself up for dealing with them better. And I think for potential fault lines, so this is, they exist, but they may or may not become activated or may not become a problem. What can we do when we notice that there is one? Well, we can put norms in place that help bridge the fault line. So if there's a fault line between people on that side of the room and this side of the room, we make sure there's a weekly meeting between maybe 2 of you to ensure that there's adequate communication. Some sort of norm to ensure that there's this communication. Cross-fault line engagement. So asking people that are belonging to different sides of the fault line to either interact or work on a project or pieces of a project together. And something like what I like to call identity play. So say there's a fault line based on childcare. So for those who don't have that concern, is there a way that you can start to understand what it feels like to be someone who does have that concern? So maybe the manager says, you know what, take 2 hours and go spend some time at a daycare at the end of the day and watch these harried parents come to pick up their children and they're still doing work. And maybe it gives you some empathy for what those parents are dealing with. So put yourselves in the other shoes and play with those identities so that there can be more understanding. I think knowing the difference between conflict types and not just saying, all conflict is bad, right? Or conflict is not something I have time to deal with, our team has more important business, figure it out yourselves. Right? But if you know these conflict types, then you can start to think, how can I strategically use what I know about this and set up some things in place ahead of time. In terms of response and adjustment, so you can adjust the fault line potential. You can bring in new team members or switch teams around so that if there are potential fault lines that are causing problems, then shift them up a little bit. Right? Add another female to this group, and so it maybe changes the dynamics of things. And give team members specific roles that bridge the fault line. So maybe two people on opposite ends of a fault line are tasked with engaging in devil's advocacy in terms of issues that the other subgroup cares about. Encouraging process and task conflict at the beginning of projects. Right? So not just saying, hopefully it happens. Like, no, this is going to happen. We are going to spend the first 3 days of this time that's allocated to this project making sure that we are all 100% agreement that we know what the task is and who is going to be doing what. And then discourage relationship conflict. So if there's relationship conflict, I'm going to deal with it quickly. And not in a way like, you guys work it out. Okay, what's the issue? Okay, we're not going to have that anymore. If there's any more relationship conflict like this, then here's what's going to happen, right? So we've created the norms ahead of time. And finally, for recovery and adaptation, we do see in some of the fault lines literature that there can be some advantages to having a fault line. What are they? If they're managed carefully, if you two are part of a subgroup, if you have ideas, you will discuss them very deeply, and you will come up with potential problems, and you will have some good knowledge. There's another subgroup here. You'll do the same with your concerns. So you both now have really worked through problems, and so it's not like you're just kind of brainstorming random ideas. You have really good ideas. Now we just have to communicate with one another, right? So information elaboration is really good in subgroups. And then now you as a leader can help with that knowledge sharing across the subgroups. And then finally, conflict handling post-mortem. We often think about, oh, thank goodness that conflict is resolved, right? I'm done, I'm out of here. Well, take some time to figure out where that conflict came from. Did it come from a fault line? Did it come from something else in terms of how the leader was handling something? Or did it come from, like, maybe there's just a team member who's very toxic? But understanding what underlies that conflict can really help you in terms of saying, okay, now we've created a system so that the next time a conflict might occur, we are in place to deal with it. And finally, agreement on norms for handling future conflict. That is all I have. So I just wanted to throw out some thoughts and ideas in terms of how to think about fault lines and conflict in these computer-mediated environments. I do think this is going to be a super important area in our fields as we move forward, and it does tie into the more macro issues as teams of people are coming together from all different areas to work on these big grand challenge problems, and we need to figure out how to deal with that. So, thank you.